Tonight we're going to finish chapter 14. Now, to be honest with you, most people have a hard time or difficult time understanding chapter 14 because they don't realize that all of the visions in it are proleptic. In other words, they refer to future events as if they've already happened or as if they're happening at the present time. As an example, when the second angel proclaims that Babylon has fallen, he's proclaiming it as if it's already happened. But the truth is, it hasn't happened yet. It doesn't happen until chapter 18, verse number 2. But he's proclaiming it as if it's already happened. That's what proleptic means. You're referring to an event as if it's already happened, even though it hasn't. Or you're referring to an event as if it's happening right now, but it really isn't. It's a future event. So in a sense, these proleptic visions in chapter 14 are a preview of what's to come in the last half of the tribulation. In verses 1 through 5, we see the 144,000 in heaven, and they're singing a new song. But the truth is, they're not in heaven yet, at least not at this point in the timeline. So let's go back and look at the chart here. If you look at chapter 14 right through here, this is a major interlude. But the interesting thing about it is, it's talking like the 144,000, which is right here, is taking place right now, right after the seventh trumpet. But the truth of the matter is, not all of them are going to be martyred until the end of the seven vials. So we can't look at this and say, now wait a minute, the 144,000 are all in heaven. No, not yet. They will be in heaven because they're all going to be martyred sometime during the last half of the tribulation. They're going to be martyred for refusing to take the mark of the beast or refusing to worship the image of the beast. But John sees the 144,000 in heaven as if it's already happened. In verses 6 through 7, John has a vision of an angel flying across the sky, proclaiming that the hour of judgment has come. But the truth is, the hour of God's judgment has not yet come. At least not at this point in the timeline. Again, if we look at where this timeline takes place, this timeline is taking place right here. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't take place until chapters 15 and 16. So even though it's proclaiming that the hour has come, it really hasn't come yet. It will very shortly. And sure enough, as I said in chapters 15 and 16, we see God's wrath poured out upon the earth through these seven vials. In verse number 8, John has another vision of an angel proclaiming that Babylon has fallen. And as I've already said time and time again, Babylon doesn't fall until the 18th chapter, verse number 2. But this angel is proclaiming it as if it's already happened. What does that tell us? It tells us that this is a proleptic vision. It's a preview of what's to come. God is so sure that it's going to happen, He goes ahead and announces it. This has already happened, though it hasn't happened yet. In verses 9 through 11, John has a vision of another angel, warning people not to take the mark or to worship the image of the beast. He tells them that they take the mark or they worship the image of the beast, they're going to suffer eternal damnation, which will happen. But it won't happen until the great white throne judgment. And where is the great white throne judgment? It's all the way back here. We're going to get right in here in the great white, right there's the great white throne judgment. But he acts as if it's going to take place immediately. And now we come to what we're going to study tonight, which is verses 14 through 20. And let me remind you, this vision is also proleptic. In other words, it's a vision of an event that's not going to take place until the very end of the tribulation. But when you read it, it sounds as if it's taking place right now, but it's not. It's proleptic. But those who don't understand this, they try to place this event right after the seventh trumpet in the timeline. And that's what confuses them. It doesn't make sense. All of a sudden, you see this judgment taking place right about here, the seventh trumpet. But you know what? It's not supposed to take place until Jesus Christ actually returns here in chapter 19. And so most people, as they're reading along, because this is the way we write in Western literature. We write everything in chronological order. We don't skip around. We don't read the end of the book unless we're just curious or nosy that, we're afraid that this book isn't going to end right. So what do? We go to the end of the book and we read that little bit there just to assure us, okay, this book's going to end right. I'll keep on reading it. And we go back to where we were, right? Well, it's different in these visions that John is having. Before the actual events begin to take place in the last half of the tribulation, John has these series of visions, and they're proleptic. They don't fit at this place in the timeline. They are future events. It's kind of like, as I've said, a preview of what's going to take place. And if you don't understand that, chapter 14 doesn't make sense to you. So turn to chapter 14, and let's read verses 14 through 20. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud. And upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar which had power over fire. And he cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it in the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse's bridle, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. So let me ask you a question. What event is this vision referring to? I think I've already mentioned it earlier. What's it referring to? It's referring to the second coming of Jesus Christ and the battle of Armageddon. So this vision is a preview of what's going to take place when Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation. And I'm kind of glad that God gave John these series of proleptic visions. And the reason I'm glad he did that is because you could almost be overwhelmed as we get to the middle of the tribulation and we start seeing the wrath of God poured out in these vials, and we see all these horrible things happening. If we didn't know what was going to take place at the end, we might just become dismayed, give up, not finish the book. But the good thing is, God gives John these series of proleptic visions to tell us what's going to happen in the end. So these verses 14 through 20, is referring to Jesus Christ returning and the battle of Armageddon. Now, when Christ returns, there's going to be a harvesting of the earth. The harvesting of the grain symbolizes the harvesting of the saints, those who didn't take the mark, those who did not worship the image of the beast. Now, the reason they're on the earth in the first place is because they were not ready when the rapture occurred. These are the people who got saved as a result of the 144,000 preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Or maybe they sat in church all their life, but they never received the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when the rapture occurred and all of their loved ones were raptured and they were left behind, they turned their life to Jesus Christ. But for whatever reason, they turned to Jesus. And when he comes, part of the harvest is him reaping the saints. The harvesting of the grapes, on the other hand, symbolizes the harvesting of the wicked. Those who took the mark and worshiped the image of the beast. They're going to be gathered together for destruction. So, now that you understand the overall meaning of this vision and where it fits in the timeline, let's study it verse by verse. Now, the reason I said where it fits in the timeline, again, if you have your chart, even though we're right here, chapters 12 and 14, we've been studying all of this. This vision in verses 14 through 20 has to do with chapter 19, when Jesus returns in the battle of Armageddon. Does that make sense? So now that you know where it fits in the timeline, let's tear this apart verse by verse. Verse 14, And I looked, and behold a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. Here we have a picture of Jesus Christ returning to the earth. He's sitting on a white cloud. Now, it gives the impression as you read this in the Greek that the cloud is his throne and he's descending on it. He's wearing a golden crown, and this is kind of an interesting crown. It's not a diadem. This is actually the type of crown that you wore when you won or you were victorious in some type of either game or battle. And when you were victorious, you would wear this type of crown. So when Jesus returns, he's returning as the victorious Messiah. You know, it's kind of interesting. But so many people do not understand that Jesus won his victory through his death, burial, and resurrection. But when he left, most people didn't see the victory that he earned. But when he comes back, he's going to be wearing a golden crown. He is going to be wearing the sign of victory. And he also has a sharp sickle in his hand, ready to begin the harvest. And this is kind of an interesting little passage here, because the first harvest in this vision is a harvest of the elect, the saints. The second harvest is a harvest of the wicked. But they both happen at the very same time. They both happen when Jesus Christ returns. So even though in this vision we're getting two different pictures, we're seeing a harvest of the saints and we're seeing a harvest of the wicked, we need to understand that this harvest takes place at the very same time, when Jesus Christ returns. So let me explain a few things so you'll understand what I'm talking about. When Jesus first came, he came as a sower. The seed that he was sowing was the Word of God. Those who received the Word of God were born again, and they produced fruit in their life. But the final harvest does not happen until Jesus returns. In fact, Jesus referred to the harvest as the end of the world. I want you to turn to the parable of the tares in Matthew the 13th chapter, verses 37 through 43. How many of you remember the parable of the tares? In fact, let me give you a little background information. This isn't in my notes, but you do need to understand this. When Jesus came, one of the reasons that the Jews did not receive him is because the vision they had of a Messiah was overthrowing Rome's rule, setting up the Davidic kingdom immediately and judging the world. And so that's what they were actually looking for. That's why the cross was a stumbling block. They didn't understand the victory would be attained in that manner. Did the Old Testament prophesy that Jesus would have to die? That he would be buried and he would be resurrected? Of course. You just have to read Isaiah 53 to see that. But they got so caught up on the judgment part of it, and when he comes, the Davidic kingdom is going to be set up, that they didn't understand that there would be a period of time between his, let me just go back a little bit. I don't even want to say period of time. I want to say they didn't understand that Jesus would actually come twice. The Messiah would come twice. He would come the first time, and then there would be a period of time between his first coming and his second coming, and they didn't understand that. And so Jesus told parables in order for them to understand that there was going to be a period of time between the first coming of the Messiah and the second coming of the Messiah, and that was going to be known as the church age. So the parable of the tares is one of these parables that Jesus taught. So knowing that, let's read it. He answered and said unto them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. Now who is the Son of Man? Jesus. It's pretty simple. Jesus was referred to as the Son of Man. So he said, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. And notice this. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire, and there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. Now this is kind of interesting, because remember I told you in chapter 10, we saw this great angel who looks much like Jesus, but he's not Jesus. He's the proxy. He's coming in and he has a judgment summons, and he puts one foot on the earth and one foot upon the ocean or the seas. What he's doing, he's actually taking, how do I say this? He's now coming in and saying, I'm going to take the earth for Jesus. We're now claiming it as ours. They had the title deed, but now they're coming in, they're taking possession of it. And so we saw that when the seventh trumpet was blown, that the kingdoms of this world became the kingdoms of our God and of His Lord. And so now we're seeing the possession of it. Now we're going to jump to the very end. And He says, or He tells us in this parable of the tares, that when the kingdom comes, He is going to go and get the wicked and pull them up because they're not to be in His kingdom. And that's what we're seeing. Now, I want you to notice when the harvest occurs according to the parable of the tares. The harvest is the end of the world. So when the Son of Man returns, when Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation, there is going to be a final harvest. And that's what this vision is all about. The final harvest. Verses 14 through 16 is the harvest of the righteous, the harvest of the saints. Verses 17 through 20 is the harvest of the wicked. But they're both part of this final harvest, and they happen at the same time. They happen when Jesus Christ returns. But Jesus wants to make sure we don't mix them up, because what happens to the righteous is totally different than what happens to the wicked. So He keeps them separate in this vision. That's why in verses 14 through 16, we see the harvest of the righteous. And then in verses 17 through 20, we see the harvest of the wicked. But make no mistake about it, this great harvest happens at the same time. They happen simultaneously when Jesus returns. Verse 15. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, "Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap. For the harvest of the earth is ripe." It's interesting that an angel has to tell the Son of Man that it's time for the final harvest. You would think that Jesus wouldn't have to have an angel to tell Him that it's time. But if you remember, no one knows the day or the hour of the final harvest except God. Not even Jesus. Look at Mark chapter 13, verse number 32. However, no one knows the day or hour when these things will happen. Not even the angels in heaven or the Son Himself. Only the Father knows. So this angel is not telling Jesus what to do. He's not commanding Him. He's not ordering Him to do anything. He's just God's messenger. He's coming out of the temple. God said, "Go tell my son that it's time to harvest." Because the only one who knows the day or the hour is God. Not even Jesus knows that. That's why that angel came out to tell him. It's time to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. Now, if you remember, the 144,000 were referred to as first fruits in verse number 4. What are the first fruits? Well, if you remember, the first fruits were what the Israelites were supposed to bring, the best of their crops. You know, not all of the crops mature at the same time. You always have a portion of your crops that when they're starting to ripen, that will ripen before all the others. So the Israelites were supposed to take those as the first fruits and present them to God. So the 144,000 were the first fruits. They were considered to be the first fruits of the tribulation before the final harvest of the saints. Now, let me show you something interesting. I want you to underline the word ripe. It's translated from the Greek word kaseiraino, which literally means dried or dried up. Now, when it refers to grain, it means it's been ripe for a while. You've let it sit out there and it's ripe and you haven't harvested it when you should. It sat there for a while. So the implication is that God in His mercy has delayed the final harvest until the last possible minute. Now, why would God do that? Now, some of us think, well, it's because the judgment's coming. No. The reason God delays it for so long is because He is a merciful God. He wants everyone to be saved that will be saved. Verse 16. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now, I want you to notice who's doing the reaping of the righteous? Who's doing the reaping of the saints? Who is it? It's Jesus. He's the one who's gathering in the saints. But that won't be the case when it comes to the wicked. Verses 17 through 19 tells us that an angel is going to gather the wicked. And that coincides perfectly with the parable of the tares. I want you to turn back to the parable of the tares in Matthew 13, and we're going to read verses 41 through 42. Jesus is telling this parable, and he says this, the Son of Man, and Jesus, of course, referred to himself as the Son of Man, so he's talking about himself. Jesus shall send forth his angels, and they, who is they referring to? His angels. They shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So, when Jesus comes, he's going to gather all of the saints to him, but he's also going to gather the wicked. What's he going to do with the wicked? Well, that takes us to verses 17 and 18. Look at verses 17 and 18. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, but he also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar which had power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle and gather the cluster of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. Now, did you notice that grain or wheat was used to represent the saints? But it does not represent the wicked. What does he use to represent the wicked? He uses grapes. Now, if I would have wanted to stay parallel with the parable of the tares, I probably would have put tares here. But there's a reason why he uses grapes to represent the wicked. The reason he uses grapes to represent the wicked is because it's a great picture of what's going to happen to the wicked when Jesus returns. You see, the main purpose for raising grapes in their day was to make wine. And the way that you made wine was that you gathered all of the grapes up and you put them into a wine press. And then the women would get into the wine press, and sometimes you would let small children do that, but they would get into the wine press barefooted. And they would crush the grapes by stepping on them. Now, the reason that they were barefoot is because you did not want to crush the seeds. And if you're barefoot, your skin is pliable enough and the tissue at the bottom of your feet that you can feel them, but you don't have enough weight if you're barefoot to actually crush the seeds. And the reason you don't want to crush the seeds is because it makes the wine very bitter. Does that make sense? So the women would get into this wine press, and they would grab the bottom of their dresses, and they would pull them up, and they would tuck them into a rope or whatever they had tied around their waist, and they would tuck it in. And the reason they would tuck it in is because they didn't want to stain their clothes. Sometimes, if you weren't careful and you had some little children in there with you, they would think it was really cool and they'd start jumping on those grapes. And what would the women do? Don't do that. Just trample them. Because if you start jumping on them, what's going to happen? That grape juice is going to start splattering everywhere and it's going to stain your clothes, and they didn't want to stain their clothes. So they would trample all of these grapes, and the juice from the crushed grapes would begin to flow into a lower container. And that's how they would gather their wine, or in other words, the first process in making the wine. Now, I want you to see how this very same process is used to describe what's going to happen to the wicked when Jesus Christ returns. Look at verses 19 and 20. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and he gathered the vine of the earth and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Now, are the righteous going to be cast into the great winepress of God's wrath? No. We don't have to experience the wrath of God. Not because we're perfect, not because we're righteous, but because Jesus experienced God's wrath for us. We covenanted with him and became one spirit with him. He was made our sin. He experienced the wrath of God for our sin. And when all of our sin was paid for, God raised him from the dead. Therefore, we don't have to face the wrath of God. But those who have rejected Jesus Christ, because they refuse to receive him as their Lord and Savior, they must face the wrath of God. because they rejected God's means or method of procuring salvation. Does that make sense? Now, what's kind of interesting, it says, and the angel thrusted his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horses' bridles by the space of 1,600 furlongs. How many of you have heard that the blood is going to be as high as a horse's bridle at the Battle of Armageddon? Where do we get that? Right here. This is the vision where we see that. Now, let's kind of go through this and see what he's talking about. He tells us that an angel is going to gather the wicked, and he's going to throw them into the winepress of God's wrath. And then the Son of Man tramples them until the blood flows over the entire nation of Israel. Now, if you noticed, it doesn't say that Jesus is the one that's going to trample the grapes, does it? So how do I know that the Son of Man is going to be the one that when all the grapes are thrown into the great winepress of God's wrath, that Jesus is the one that's going to get in there and trample them? I know that because of the book of Isaiah. Turn to Isaiah chapter 63. I'm going to read verses 2 and 3, and then I'm going to jump down to verse number 6. This prophecy in the book of Isaiah is referring to the Battle of Armageddon. It's referring to when the Messiah comes back the second time. All right? Notice what it says. Why are your clothes so red, as if you have been treading out grapes? I have been treading the winepress alone. No one was there to help me. Now, it doesn't mean that he's upset that no one was by himself. It means that I did it and I did it alone. Who is I? The Son of Man. In my anger, I have trampled my enemies as if they were grapes. In my fury, I have trampled my foes. Their blood has stained my clothes. Verse 6. I crushed the nations in my anger, and I made them stagger and fall to the ground, spilling their blood upon the earth. So according to Isaiah, Jesus is the one who's going to trample the wicked with such fury that he won't even care that he's staining his clothes. Now, again, I want to say this. Because making clothing was so much more difficult in Jesus' time. You didn't just go down to, I was going to say Anthony's, but I don't even know if there is an Anthony's anymore. You didn't just go to Walmart or you didn't just go to J.C. Penney or any place like that and buy your pants and buy your shirts. No, you made everything. And you bartered and you got these things, but you didn't want to stain your clothing. So you would use old clothing, but even then, you didn't want to stain it. So women would take great care to pull that up to make sure that they didn't splatter it. But the picture that he's giving us here in the book of Isaiah is that Jesus is so furious that he jumps into this winepress of God's wrath. He doesn't even take time to pull up his garments. He doesn't care about that. And he still has the sandals on. And he's crushing even the seeds. And the reason he's crushing that is because it is a time of bitterness. And he's just splattering the blood of all of these people who come. And you know what's kind of interesting? It says that their blood is going to be splattered everywhere. In fact, Revelation chapter 14 verse 20 tells us that their blood is going to flow over the entire nation of Israel. How many of you have the impression that the Battle of Armageddon is only going to take place in this small little valley? Anyone have that impression? I think the majority of us do. I think if you were honest, well, the Battle of Armageddon, that's why it's called. It's going to take place. Well, if you ever go to Israel with me, we'll go to a place called Megiddo. It's a tale. About 25 different cities have been built in this particular spot. And the reason it's been built in this particular spot is because it's right at the side of the Jezreel Valley. And this Jezreel Valley is this big, beautiful valley, very fertile. But this is one of the most strategic places to control Israel. And so as a result of that, everyone wants to have a city there. Well, because this valley, and it's very hilly country, because this valley is so big, all of these armies are going to begin to gather here But I want you to understand, that is not the only place that the battle is going to be fought. It's only referred to as that because that's probably where the command post is going to be. That's where they're going to begin the assembly. I want you to turn back to verse number 20 in chapter 14. I'm going to read this verse and kind of tear it apart if you don't mind. And the winepress was trodden without the city. What city is it talking about? Jerusalem. We don't know how this is going to take place because we know that the woman fled to the wilderness, but sometime during that, I don't know if they're going to trickle back or there's going to be a few that stayed in Jerusalem, but it's kind of interesting. It's like there's a revolution that's taking place. And in fact, what's kind of interesting is it seems that there's a rebellion against the beast. And he comes back to the land of Israel to cut them off. And when he does, they gather together and the Son of Man is coming. And so they join together to fight against Jesus. But it says that the winepress was trodden without the city. And the reason it's saying that is because Jerusalem is the only place that's probably going to be protected from this battle. Everywhere else, the battle is around Jerusalem. And in fact, it's going to be right outside of Jerusalem. We're going to see that in a minute. And it said, and blood came out of the winepress, even into the horse's bridle, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Now, let me just kind of go through this bit by bit. What this is saying is that the blood is going to be splattered as high as a horse's bridle. It doesn't mean that it will flow as high as a horse's bridle. It means it will be splattered that high. Now again, let's get the picture, because the picture that God was giving to John in this vision was that there is this winepress. And the main thing that you did not want to do in the winepress was to get in there and begin to trample it where the grape juice starts splattering everywhere. Number one, you're wasting the juice. Number two, you're staining your clothes. So you trampled it, but you took great care not to splatter. But the picture that Isaiah gives us is that when Jesus comes back in his fury, he doesn't care where it goes. He doesn't care if it stains his clothes. He comes to do one thing. He comes to crush and trample his enemies. And so what this is telling us is that when he comes, the blood is going to be splattered as high as a horse's bridle. Something that was unthought of in a winepress. And the whole nation of Israel is going to be covered with it. This won't just happen in the valley of Jezreel. You need to understand, Megiddo was a city. We'll drive there if you go to Israel with me. We'll walk up on it. But you'll see that it's next to the valley of Jezreel. Some people refer to it as the valley of Armageddon, but it's not the valley of Armageddon. It's the valley of Jezreel. But it's such a strategic place that this is where it's all going to begin to happen. But the most interesting thing about it is, it's not just going to take place there. This battle is going to be fought all over Israel. Look back at verse 20. Blood came out of the winepress, even in the horse's bridle, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. That's 1,600 furlongs, which is about 184 miles. Now here's what's interesting. That's the approximate length of Israel from their northern border, the Syrian border, all the way to their southern border, which is the Egyptian border. So if you went and you looked at how long Israel is, it's 184 miles. In John's day, you would say it's 1,600 furlongs. So what this is telling us is that the Battle of Armageddon isn't confined to the valley of Jezreel, where the city of Megiddo is. Now, how many of you know that where we get the word Armageddon is Harma, which means mountain? And the city of Megiddo looks like it's built upon a hill, and it's called Armageddon, or the hill of Megiddo. But the reason it is because so many different cities have been built there. And what would take place is that when a city would be destroyed, and whoever conquered it would begin to build their city in that same place, they would build on top of the destroyed city. So after all of these years, from the beginning of mankind, this is a hill. And it's known as the hill of Megiddo, which in English is translated Armageddon. So this battle isn't just going to be fought there. It's going to start there, but it's going to be fought throughout Israel. And it's going to cover all of Israel. Turn to Zechariah chapter 14. I'm going to read verses 4 through 5. On that day, what day? The great day of the Lord, when the Messiah returns, when Jesus Christ comes back. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives will split apart, making a wide valley running from east to west. Half the mountain will move to the north, half towards the south. Boy, this is kind of amazing. If you go to the Mount of Olives, we'll actually go behind it. We'll look towards the Judean wilderness and we'll see where Jesus raised Lazarus, and you'll realize, man, he could have walked to Jerusalem in about an hour. It's just right there. But when he stands on the Mount of Olives, there's going to be a great earthquake. And that mountain is going to move to the north and the south, and it's all going to be leveled out right there at Jerusalem. And then it says, for it will reach across to Azal. Now, Azal is a place where we don't quite know exactly where it is, but it's close to Jerusalem. Yes, you will flee as you did from the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come. And notice this, and all his holy ones with him. Who are his holy ones? Us. Us. We are going to come back with Jesus. We're going to rule with him. We're going to reign with him. But we're going to follow him back. Now, look at Joel chapter 3, verse number 2. I will gather the armies of the world into the valley of Jehoshaphat. How many of you know where the valley of Jehoshaphat is? Anyone? Jehoshaphat actually means judgment. And the valley of Jehoshaphat is the same valley that we normally refer to as the Kidron Valley. Now, the Kidron Valley is actually the valley that runs between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem. And you need to understand that when you stand on the Mount of Olives, you look right down into Jerusalem. You look right at the Temple Mount. And the only thing that's separating you from the Mount of Olives from the Temple Mount is this valley. In fact, what's kind of interesting is when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, it's at the very foot of the Mount of Olives. And when they came and got Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and took him to Caiaphas' house, they actually took him to the valley of Jehoshaphat, the Kidron Valley, and walked him up to Caiaphas' house. In fact, you can still go, and the steps from Jesus' day are there, and we're pretty sure when you go to what we consider to be Caiaphas' house that it truly is Caiaphas' house. And if you ever go there, I'll explain how we know that it is. But what's kind of interesting, it says, I will gather the armies of the world into the valley of Jehoshaphat. So these armies aren't just going to be in the Jezreel Valley where Megiddo is, Armageddon. They're also going to be where Jerusalem is. There I will judge them for harming my people, my special possession, for scattering my people among the nations, and for dividing up my land. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Did you catch that last little part? And for dividing up my land. I am not an advocate of land for peace. That is not the Palestine's land, the Palestinians. That is the Jews' land. God gave that to them. And one of the reasons is he's upset at the nations is because they scattered his people among the nations. And then it says, and they divided up my land. That is his land. But the whole thing that I want you to see is that this battle that sometimes we think is going to happen in this little place, you need to understand, all of the armies of the nations are going to gather in this little place like Israel. And they're going to surround Jerusalem, and they're all over the nation. And it's like, oh my gosh, I don't even know why God brought these people back to this land. It's all over. They're going to just wipe them off the face of the earth. And if you've been following what I've said, I truly believe that the one world religion is not going to be the New Age movement. It's going to be Islam. And they're going to come and they're going to want to wipe the Jews off the face of the earth. And guess what's going to take place? Jesus is going to return at that very moment. And he is going to trample the wicked as a person tramples grapes. And he's going to do it in his fury, because these are people that have come to even fight against him. And this is a preview of Armageddon. So, even though we're not there yet in the timeline, we're still where it says, major interlude, chapters 12 through 14. This doesn't actually happen till we get to chapter 19. But this is a proleptic vision. Because we saw the beast in chapter 13, because we saw the Antichrist appear, because we saw his system, and we realized that if you didn't take the mark, you wouldn't be able to buy or sell, and because we saw that if you didn't worship the image of the beast, you were going to be murdered, before you get dismayed, God says, okay, I don't want to just get there. Let me just interject something here. And he gives us these proleptic visions in verse number 14 to encourage us, to tell us, hey, listen, the second half of the tribulation is going to be bad, but let me tell you how it ends. The wicked will be trampled when Jesus returns. And so now all of a sudden, we're kind of like the person, and I'm guilty of this. I'm reading along in a book, and I think, boy, if this doesn't end good, I'm going to really be irritated. So I go to the last couple of pages and I read it to make sure, okay, it ends good. Now some of you go, I never do that because it ruins the book. Well, I see enough bad in my life, I always like things to end good. So then I go back and I start reading again. That's what God is doing. He wants you to know that it is going to end good. And so now when we get into chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, it's like, oh my gosh. But in the back of your mind should be, it ends good.